The wind on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota has a way of carrying secrets. It moves low across the flat, pale earth, bending the dry grass, slipping through the cracks of old trailers, and whispering things that most people would rather forget. On a cold October morning, it carried the sound of a dog crying. She was lying in a ditch beside a gravel road about 3 miles outside of town. Her fur, once a warm honeygold, was matted with blood and dirt. Her ribs pressed through her skin like the keys of a broken piano. She was a medium-sized dog, some mix of retriever and shepherd, with soft brown eyes that had seen far too much cruelty for any living creature to bear. She could not lift her head. She could barely breathe. A passing driver slowed his truck, looked down at her from his window, then drove on. The world kept moving. She stayed still. Nobody knows exactly what happened to her before that morning. The truth, pieced together later by the vet who treated her, told a story that was almost impossible to sit with. She had been beaten. Several of her ribs were fractured. There were burn marks on her back legs, the kind that come from rope left on too long in freezing temperatures. One of her ears had been torn, likely during a fight she had been forced into. She was severely malnourished, dehydrated, and running a dangerous fever. The vet estimated she had been lying in that ditch for at least 2 days before anyone stopped. Her name, at that point, was nothing. She had no name. She was just a dog that someone had used up and thrown away, like something with no value, no soul, no right to a tomorrow. It was a boy on a bicycle who finally stopped. He was 12 years old, a Lakota kid named Marcus who rode that road every day after school. He saw her from a distance and thought at first she was a pile of rags. But then the pile moved. He dropped his bike in the gravel, walked slowly to the edge of the ditch, and crouched down. She looked up at him. Despite everything, the pain, the hunger, the cold, her tail moved. Just once. Just barely. But it moved. Marcus did not have a phone. He had nothing with him except a half-eaten granola bar and a bottle of water from his backpack. He broke the granola bar into small pieces and placed them near her nose. She ate them slowly, each bite a small act of survival. He poured water into his cupped hand and held it to her mouth. She drank. Then Marcus got back on his bicycle and rode as fast as he had ever ridden in his life, straight to the home of the one man on the reservation he knew could help. That man was Chief Raymond Hollowbear. Raymond Hollowbear was not a chief in the ceremonial or political sense alone. He was a man the community simply trusted, deeply, completely, without question. He was in his late 60s, with a broad face carved by decades of weather and worry, silver-streaked braids that fell past his shoulders, and hands that looked like they had built and repaired everything worth building and repairing in the county. He had served his people in more ways than could be counted. He had buried friends, raised grandchildren who were not his own, and sat with strangers through the worst nights of their lives without ever asking for anything in return. When Marcus came flying up his driveway, out of breath and wide-eyed, Raymond stepped off his porch and listened. He asked no unnecessary questions. He simply nodded, picked up a worn blanket from inside his front door, walked to his truck, and said, "Show me where she is." They found her exactly as Marcus had left her. Raymond climbed down into the ditch without hesitation. He wrapped the blanket around her gently, speaking softly the entire time, not in English, but in Lakota. Words that Marcus did not fully understand but felt in his chest like something warm. Raymond lifted her with the careful steadiness of a man who understood that some broken things must be handled as though they are made of glass. He placed her in the back seat of his truck. She did not fight him. She did not growl or snap. She simply looked at him with those exhausted brown eyes and let herself be carried. Raymond looked at Marcus and said quietly, "You did good, son. You did real good." They drove to the nearest vet, 40 minutes away. The entire ride, Raymond kept one hand on the wheel and the other resting gently on her side, so she could feel his warmth and know, maybe for the first time, that a human hand did not always mean pain. The animal clinic in the nearest town was small, underfunded, and perpetually overwhelmed. Dr. Angela Reyes had been the only full-time vet within a 60-mile radius for the past 4 years. She had seen neglect before, animals starved, chained, forgotten. But when Raymond Hollowbear walked through her door carrying a blanket-wrapped dog who barely had the strength to blink, Angela felt something tighten in her chest that she could not immediately name. She set the dog on the examination table and began her assessment with practiced, quiet efficiency. What she found made her jaw tighten. Fractured ribs, 3 of them. A deep infection in her left rear leg, likely from a wound that had gone untreated for weeks. Severe anemia. Internal bruising consistent with repeated blunt force trauma. Her body temperature was dangerously low. Her heart rate was irregular. She was, by any clinical measure, close to the end. Angela looked up at Raymond, who stood at the edge of the room with his arms folded and his expression unreadable. "She's in critical condition," Angela said. "I need to be honest with you. It could go either way." Raymond nodded slowly. "Then we fight for her," he said. "Whatever she needs." The next 72 hours were the kind that test both medicine and faith in equal measure. Angela and her assistant worked through the first night, stabilizing the dog's body temperature, starting 4 fluids, addressing the worst of her infections with antibiotics. The dog drifted in and out of a feverish unconsciousness, her legs twitching sometimes, her breathing shallow and uneven. There were moments when the monitors flatlined briefly and the whole room seemed to stop breathing with her. Raymond did not go home. He sat in the waiting area on a plastic chair with a cup of bad coffee and his hands folded in his lap. He did not sleep. He prayed, in the old way, quietly, steadily, the words moving through him like water through stone. The clinic staff told him he could leave, that they would call him. He thanked them politely and stayed right where he was. On the second morning, Angela came out and told him the dog had made it through the night. Her fever had broken. Her heart rate had stabilized. She was not out of danger yet, but she had chosen to keep fighting. Raymond exhaled in a long, slow breath and closed his eyes for just a moment. "Can I see her?" he asked. Angela led him into the back. The dog lay on a padded surface under a warm lamp, connected to a drip line, her side rising and falling in steady rhythm. She looked impossibly fragile. But when Raymond stepped close and spoke to her softly in Lakota, her eyes opened. She found him immediately, as if she had been listening for that voice even in her sleep. Her tail moved. Weak, but real. Raymond smiled, a slow, full smile that changed the whole shape of his face. He reached out and placed his hand gently on top of her head. She leaned into it. Angela watched from the doorway and felt something loosen in her own chest. In 20 years of practice, she had never seen an animal respond so immediately and so completely to a person they had only just met. It was not desperation or fear. It was recognition. As if some part of this broken, battered dog understood that she had finally found someone who would not hurt her. Over the following days, the dog's recovery was slow but steady. She ate a little more each day. She began to lift her head when Raymond entered the room. She suffered through the necessary treatments, wound cleaning, bandaging, medication, with a patience that made the vet tech cry on more than one occasion. She never snapped. She never growled. She endured everything that was done to help her with a quiet dignity that felt almost too large for her small, damaged body. Raymond named her during that week. He did not make an announcement about it or consult anyone else. He simply started calling her Wakareng, which in Lakota means sacred, or mysterious, something touched by a power greater than ordinary things. Angela heard him use the name one afternoon and asked what it meant. When he told her, she nodded and said it was exactly right. Wakareng. Sacred. A name for a dog who had been treated as worthless, given by a man who believed, in the deepest part of himself, that all life carried weight and meaning. A name that was, in itself, an act of healing. By the end of the second week, she was strong enough to stand on her own. She wobbled. She nearly fell. But she stood. Raymond was there when it happened. He stood beside her, not touching, just present, and watched her find her balance with the focused, tender attention of someone witnessing something genuinely holy. When she steadied herself and looked up at him, he said softly, "There you are. There she is." Those around them in the clinic that day said the moment was so quiet and so complete that nobody wanted to be the first to speak and break it open. Raymond brought Wakareng home on a Thursday afternoon in early November. The reservation was wrapped in the flat gray light of late autumn, and a cold wind moved across the open land as he carried her from his truck to the small, warm house he shared with his adult daughter, Serena, and her 2 young children. Serena met him on the porch. She looked at the dog in his arms, thin, healing, wrapped in a fresh blanket, and said simply, "I put an old quilt in the corner by the wood stove." That was that. The first days were delicate. Wakareng moved through the house slowly, testing each room with the careful, uncertain steps of someone who had learned that new places could mean new dangers. She startled at sudden sounds. She flinched when hands moved too quickly near her face. She preferred corners and edges, places where she could see the whole room and have her back against something solid. These were not signs of a broken spirit. They were signs of an intelligent animal who had learned, through real experience, that the world was not reliably safe. Raymond understood this completely. He did not try to rush her comfort. He did not smother her with attention or force affection she was not ready to receive. He simply existed near her, in the patient, unhurried way that seemed to come naturally to him. He let her set the pace. If she came to him, he acknowledged her warmly. If she retreated, he gave her the space she needed without making her feel guilty for needing it. In the mornings, he sat on the porch with his coffee before the rest of the house woke, and within the first week, Wakaring began joining him. She would emerge from inside, cross the porch slowly, and settle near his feet, not touching him at first, just near. He would talk to her in that low, steady way of his, sometimes in Lakota, sometimes in English, never demanding a response, never requiring her to perform gratitude. He told her about the land. About the history of his people. About the old stories his grandmother had told him when he was small. He talked to her the way you talk to someone you respect, as though what she thought and felt mattered. She listened. Every morning, she listened. By the second week, she had moved close enough that her side pressed against his leg. By the third, she rested her chin on his knee. Serena's children, Lily and Tobias, ages 6 and 9, were a different kind of test. Children are loud and unpredictable, and for an animal with Wakaring's history, loud and unpredictable were deeply associated with pain. Raymond sat the children down before they were allowed near her. He spoke to them seriously, the way he spoke to adults, because he believed children rose to the level of respect they were given. He explained that Wakaring had been hurt by people who did not know how to be kind. He told them that her healing was not finished, that it would take time, and that the greatest gift they could give her was stillness and patience. Lily, who was 6 and had enormous serious eyes, asked, "Like how you have to be quiet near a bird's nest so the mama doesn't fly away?" Raymond looked at her steadily and said, "Exactly like that." The children were extraordinary. They sat on the floor near Wakaring without reaching for her, letting her investigate them on her own terms. They offered her small treats from flat, open palms. They spoke in low voices and moved with a care that seemed almost impossible for children their age. And slowly, over days, then weeks, Wakaring began to lean into them. First Tobias, then Lily. She allowed their small hands on her back. She licked Lily's cheek once, unexpectedly, and the little girl erupted in a delighted, whispered laugh that made the whole room feel lighter. But it was with Raymond that the deepest change took place. One evening, about 3 weeks after coming home, Wakaring crossed the room, climbed onto the couch beside him while he was reading, turned in 2 careful circles, and lay down with her head across his lap. She released a long, slow breath, the kind of exhale that holds everything a body has been carrying, and was asleep within minutes. Raymond set his book down. He placed his hand on her side and felt her breathe. His daughter, watching from the kitchen doorway, saw his eyes fill, though he would never have said so. He sat perfectly still for 2 hours, unwilling to move and disturb her, because she was sleeping without fear for perhaps the first time in her life. That was the night something shifted permanently between them. She had chosen him. Not out of need or desperation, but out of something that felt like trust, genuine, hard-won, and irreversible. It was a choice she had made with full knowledge of what it had once cost her to trust, and she had made it anyway. What Raymond did not tell many people, what he kept close, the way people keep the things that are most true about themselves, was that he had been quietly falling apart for the better part of 2 years before Wakaring came into his life. His wife, Loretta, had died 26 months earlier. Breast cancer, diagnosed late, gone fast. They had been married for 41 years. She had been the kind of woman who filled every room she entered without meaning to, who could make a stranger feel like family inside of 5 minutes, who had been the still center of Raymond's world in the way that some people simply are for one another. When she died, something in Raymond went quiet in a way that he could not fix and could not fully explain, even to himself. He kept showing up. He kept being the person his community needed him to be. He attended the meetings, helped the families, counseled the young men, sat with the grieving. He never stopped. Stopping felt like a betrayal of everything Loretta had believed about what a life was for. But inside, in the private space behind all the usefulness and the steadiness and the leadership, there was a grief that had not moved. A loss he had not allowed himself to properly sit with, because sitting with it felt like it might swallow him whole. Then Wakaring arrived. And she needed him in the specific, uncomplicated way that only animals can need a person, not for his wisdom or his history or his title, but for his presence. His warmth. His hands. His voice. She needed him to simply show up and be there, and she responded to that showing up with a complete and wordless devotion that Raymond had not felt directed at him since Loretta died. He had not understood, until Wakaring, how much of himself he had closed off in the name of being strong for everyone else. She reopened things he had believed were permanently shut. She made him laugh, real laughter, the startled, uncalculated kind, when she chased a tumbleweed across the yard with more enthusiasm than sense, or when she stole a piece of fry bread from the kitchen counter and looked at him afterward with an expression of pure, unrepentant satisfaction. She woke him in the mornings by pressing her cold nose against his cheek. She sat beside him in his truck whenever he would allow it, head out the window, ears streaming back in the wind, with an expression of such complete and uncomplicated joy that Raymond often found himself smiling before he even realized he was doing it. She grieved with him on the difficult days, the anniversaries, the holidays, the moments when Loretta's absence was a physical weight in the room. On those days, Wakaing stayed close. Not bouncy or distracting, but present. As if she knew. The community noticed the change in Raymond before he noticed it himself. His daughter Serena said he seemed lighter. His old friend Thomas, who visited every few weeks for coffee and conversation, told him plainly one afternoon, "That dog fixed something in you that I didn't know how to reach." Raymond didn't deny it. He just nodded and looked out across the land. Word about Wakaing spread across the reservation the way all significant things spread, person to person, story to story. People stopped Raymond in the parking lot of the grocery store, at community meetings, at the gas station. They asked about her. They wanted to know how she was doing. Some of them came to visit, sitting on the porch and watching Wakaing move through the yard with the careful, brightening confidence of a creature reclaiming herself inch by inch. Something unexpected grew from those visits. Raymond began talking about what Wakaing's story meant, not in a lecturing way, but in the natural, unhurried way he talked about everything that mattered to him. He talked about how she had been harmed by people, and how that harm had not erased her capacity for trust. He talked about how healing was not a single moment but a long, slow return. He talked about how love, offered consistently and without conditions, could reach into places that nothing else could touch. People listened. And then people began talking about their own lives. Their own old wounds. Their own long returns. Wakaing became, without anyone planning it, a kind of living symbol on that reservation, proof that surviving the worst that people could do to you did not mean you were finished. That somewhere beyond the ditch, beyond the cold and the pain and the abandonment, there was still the possibility of a porch in the morning light, and a warm hand, and a voice that called you by a name that meant something sacred. The story of Wakaing and Raymond Hollow Bear might have stayed local, a quiet, beautiful story passed between people on a reservation in South Dakota, meaningful to those who knew them and invisible to everyone else. That is how most of the best stories live. Close to the ground. Told in small rooms. But Marcus, the 12-year-old boy who had found her in the ditch and ridden to Raymond's door, had a teacher that year who ran a school writing project. Students were asked to write about someone who had shown them what courage looked like. Marcus wrote about that October afternoon, the pile of rags in the ditch that moved, the granola bar, the cold water cupped in his hands, the ride to Raymond's house. He wrote about watching Raymond climb into the ditch without hesitation. About the Lakota words he didn't understand but could feel. About a dog whose tail moved when it had no reason left to move. His teacher submitted the essay to a regional youth writing competition. It won. A local journalist read it and wrote a short piece. The piece was picked up by a national outlet. And then, in the unpredictable way that the internet sometimes decides a story matters, it spread, shared and reshared by people who said it made them cry on the bus, in the break room, in the parking lot of a pharmacy at 10 o'clock at night. Raymond did not seek the attention and was not entirely comfortable with it. He gave a few interviews quietly and carefully, always steering the conversation back to Marcus, to Dr. Reyes, to the community, to the larger truths the story carried about neglect and healing and what human beings owed each other and the animals who lived alongside them. He never let the story become about his own goodness. That was not the point, and he knew it. The point, he said in one interview that was later widely shared, was Wakaing herself. She came to us almost gone, he said, and she chose to stay. She fought to stay. And then she chose to trust again, even after everything. That's not just an animal surviving. That's something teaching us what we're supposed to be made of. Donations arrived, for the animal clinic, for a new reservation animal rescue program that Raymond helped establish in Wakaing's name. Dr. Angela Reyes was able to hire an assistant for the first time in 4 years. A small fund was created to help reservation families afford veterinary care for their animals. Marcus, who had shown the kind of moral clarity that most adults spend their whole lives trying to find, was given a scholarship by a tribal education foundation. He used it to study veterinary science. He said, when asked, that he planned to come back and work with Dr. Reyes when he finished school. Wakaing herself lived out the years that followed in a state that could only be described as deeply, abundantly loved. She ran the land around Raymond's house with a confidence that grew steadily, season by season. She developed strong and specific opinions about squirrels, strong preferences for fry bread and Raymond's old wool blanket, and an unshakable commitment to being wherever Raymond was at all times. She slept on his bed. She attended community gatherings where people knew her name and greeted her like a dignitary. She was, by every measure, home. Raymond's granddaughter, Lily, who had once compared Wakaing to a bird in a nest, grew up telling people that her grandfather's dog had taught her the most important lesson she knew. That how you treat something helpless tells you everything about who you actually are. Not who you say you are. Not who you believe yourself to be. Who you actually are, when no one else is watching and the easy choice is to drive past. Raymond carried his grief for Loretta, that never fully left him, and he never pretended it did. But he carried it differently now. Wakaing had given him back the habit of joy. The morning coffee on the porch. The laughter over stolen bread. The warmth of a living thing that trusted him completely and without reservation. These small daily things are what a life is built from, and he had learned, through a honeygold dog found in a ditch, to receive them again with open hands. On the 2-year anniversary of the day Marcus found her, Raymond drove back to that stretch of gravel road alone, in the early morning, Wakaing riding beside him in the passenger seat with her head tilted toward the window. He stopped at the place he remembered. He sat quietly for a moment. Then he looked at her. She turned from the window and looked back at him, calm, steady, fully present, with those brown eyes that had once held nothing but pain and now held something far harder to name. Something that looked very much like peace. He said, "You made it." And she leaned over and pressed her warm face against his hand, the way she always did now, the way she had learned to do from a man who had shown her that some hands only want to hold you up. They sat there together for a long time, on that empty road between where the worst had happened and where everything good had grown, while the South Dakota wind moved low across the grass and carried their silence like something worth keeping.